Good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm very excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between John Palfrey and Nichole Pinkard. Thank you for attending. We're a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 100 videos of past events archived on our website and YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. John Palfrey is a well-respected educator, author, legal scholar, and innovator with expertise in how new media is changing learning, education, and other institutions. Since 2019, Mr. Palfrey has served as president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, arriving in Chicago after 7 years as head of school at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. From 2002 to 2008, Mr. Palfrey served as executive director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, which seeks to explore and understand cyberspace. He has deep roots at Harvard University, having attained his undergraduate and law degrees there, and for 9 years, he was the Henry N. S. III Professor of Law and Vice Dean for Library and Information Resources at Harvard Law School. He's done a whole bunch of other things, but that intro gets a little bit too long.
Thanks, Lenny.
Nichole Pinkard is an associate professor in the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University and faculty director of the Office of Community Education Partnerships. She is the founder of Digital Youth Network and L3, a social learning platform that connects youth's learning opportunities across the school, home, community, and beyond. Her current scholarly interests include the design and use of pedagogical-based social networks and socio-technical systems to support community-level ecological models of learning. Whew, I practiced that sentence. Professor Pinkard is the recipient of a 2010 Common Sense Media Award for outstanding commitment to creativity and youth, the Jan Hawkins Award for early career contributions to humanistic research and scholarship in learning technologies, and a National Science Foundation Early Career Fellowship. Let's now welcome very much John Palfrey and Nichole Pinkard.
Hey, everyone out there. So I'm really excited that we're about to have this conversation. For those in the audience, John and I have known each other for a while. We both, or at least we met during the digital media, MacArthur's Digital Media and Learning Initiative. It's interesting that, John, you're now the president of there, but we met back in 2004.
We didn't scare them off, Nichole.
Yeah, 2004, where I think everyone was trying to really understand what is this internet, what is going on at the intersection of the mobile revolution, internet and social media and social networking, and what was this going to mean for kids and learning. And so that's where we met. And so can you share a little bit about, where you started there and really thinking about the internet and how that work has sort of led you through the Born Digital and now where you find yourself at this work in connected parenting?
Absolutely, Nichole. Thank you. And let me start out by thanking you for making time tonight. It was just fabulous that you were willing to be the interlocutor tonight. I know you're super busy in all your work, so thank you for making time. And to Lonnie and Anne-Marie and the team at FAN, thank you. This is a great honor to be here. I'm a fan of FAN and really pleased to be a part of this series. So, and really grateful. And to have 38 sponsoring schools and institutions, that's really cool. And I think speaks to all of our interest in this topic. And Nichole, to your question about the beginning of this, it really does date exactly to that time when we were starting to look at these issues related to how the way in which young people learn and develop was going to be changed by technology, one way or the other. And I think we both believe that technology is something that we control and make. It's not doing stuff to us, but it is something that is, so important, such possibilities and such challenges for young people. And in our house, back then we had our first child and then quickly after that our second child, and part of it came actually as a conversation with my wife, who was studying early childhood education, early childhood development, and what she was hearing a lot of in the research at that time was that young people shouldn't be exposed to screens, that you should not be initially doing a lot online in various ways. At the same time, at the Berkman Klein Center now, at Harvard University, we were exploring, as you have done so much in your research, some of the possibilities, right? Some of the ways in which it could be a positive part of education and growth. And so in a way, the research that we started doing at that time, which was through something called the Youth and Media Lab at Harvard, was to say, how do we really engage in this topic and say, what are the ways in which the technology can be helpful? How can it enhance education? How can it enhance the kinds of issues we care about? Things like equity in access, things like equity in education and so forth, and activism, and being civic actors in the world. And what are the ways in which it's potentially quite dangerous, actually, for young people? And what are the downsides of it? And what are the concerns that we have about inequities, especially with technology and learning and so forth? I know we'll get into some of this. So that really led us to write a first book called Born Digital. It came out in 2008 and it's had a couple of editions since. And that really was a research compilation. It was doing our own research, but really trying to say, what do we know about young people and how they're growing up in this increasingly digital age? And a lot of what we did was actually interview and hang out with young people, not quite ethnographic style, but a lot of interviews and focus groups and so forth. And so the research has always been inspired by and mediated by kids. And a lot of your work around UMedia and so forth is also done. So I want to get back to that. But what happened after that was in the book talks for Born Digital, we would very often get lots of questions from parents. And my co-author Urs and I would often say, well, this isn't a book about advice. We're just telling you what the research says. And of course, we're just parents and researchers. We're not giving parenting advice. But that never was very compelling to the parents who were in the audience. And I became a head of school and was head of a high school for 7 years. And I would get lots of questions about this, kind of advice-wise. And along the way, in discussions with our publisher, it came up, well, it would actually be good to take the research you've done and try to put it into both the philosophy of parenting, but then also to say, what does the research say about each of these issues that are on parents' mind? So we basically took the 10 questions that we heard the most often from parents and then used that kind of as the chapters, in essence, the kind of spine of the book, and then tried to answer it to say, look, based on our approach, based on what the research says, based on the experience we've had, here's some ways to go about it. Not the only way, but this is at least a theory. So that's really where the Connected Parent, this book came from.
And I think that for those of you who, hopefully everyone will read the book, but I think one of the really interesting things that comes out of it for me is the structure of it, particularly where we find ourselves in this moment of the double pandemic of COVID, but also racial injustice as exemplified by the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter movements that are still going. And in this moment where it isn't a simple answer, it isn't a book to read to say, tell me what to do, or here's the step-by-step, but it really is a conversation and a process where I think parents need to be engaging with their kids, not just their kids, but the youth and their families and their communities to understand together our way forward. So can you talk a little bit about we're going to talk about some of the topics in the book, but really around the way you think about it as more so a conversation of how you're structuring the concept of what connected parenting is, not a set of lists, but more so a process and a conversation that families can engage in.
Absolutely. If we step back from this and think about our role as educators and our role as parents, it's not really about setting rules or applying specific rules, and that's just not going to work, particularly with the dynamism of technology and the dynamism of our world, where the one constant really is change. But rather, it is a process. It's an approach that we have to apply many times a day as a teacher, as a mentor in young people's lives, and of course, fundamentally as a parent. And so what we tried to do is to create a philosophy, which is this idea of the connected parent, that builds from trust. It builds from a conversation between young people and the key adults in their lives, and largely around parenting, of course. And we drew on the research that the Digital Media and Learning Network that we talked about earlier, funded by MacArthur, and that you were such a key leader in, developed around connected learning. So we said, how do we take that same connected learning ethos, apply it to this philosophy of connected parenting, and then apply that philosophy to specific issues about screen time or about privacy or about safety and so forth. So I think you're exactly right, which is it is ultimately about having an ongoing conversation with your kids in which there is trust between the two of you. And sometimes you're actually learning from your kids. And with technology, we know that's often the case, that the kids know something we don't. But there's tons of common sense, and they're very specific things that, of course, we as parents need to be able to impart. And some of that has to do what happens in the home and the ways in which we want to manage the day-to-day. Some of it has to do with what's different in a COVID era, and some of it has to do with, who do we want to be in the world and how do we want to be engaged in it? And that conversation is the core premise of this book, is how do we manage that conversation? It is a little frustrating, I'm sure, for some, saying we just really want, a specific instruction set for how to handle each of these issues, and we try to get specific about it. But ultimately, it is about an ongoing conversation over time between parents and kids.
And I think at the core, you have a phrase in there in the book, I think it's towards the end, where you say, reality, online life and offline life are not separate for our kids. It's just life. These experiences for them are seamlessly interconnected. And even for me, who studies this, and I didn't grow up that way, right? So for me, while I'm studying and I believe in that connection, those weren't my experiences. And so when I was raising my niece's 7th grade niece's twins, who were living with me for years, so it started like jumping into parenting. Even though I understand it, the reality of thinking that those were separate realities, and I can sort of take away the online as a punishment in some sense, but not really understanding how intertwined it was in everyday aspects. So can you say a little more around just really what that means? Because I think part of this conversation of how to be a connected parent really does allow us, we have to sort of think differently about from our childhood, where, you could turn off the TV and you could still go do whatever else. But the online and internet is just fundamentally just a core of today, and how we need to think about that differently in terms of how we're communicating and messaging with our kids.
Absolutely. So much of being a parent is unlearning stuff that you learned from your parents or the experience you had, and then trying to, figure out what are the enduring bits, but then also kind of translate it for the life your kids are leading. And in particular, I think this notion that there is an online life and an offline life that those of us who were born before, say, 1980 or so, experienced, where that really isn't a distinction that makes all that much sense to young people. So in particular, you might, I sometimes think about kind of online identity and in-person identity. So you and I might think, okay, we've got our LinkedIn, and what picture do we put on LinkedIn? What background do we put on LinkedIn? That's kind of our online identity. And then what clothes we put on. You would put on purple to represent Northwestern University, your dean, and your PR people must be proud of your having the right color on in your shirt. And that's my physical identity, right? That's my in-person identity. Although today it's blurred because we're online the screen. You get the point. But we often sort of think about these a little differently, whereas kids don't at all. They really see the fact that they are interacting through a device, mediated through a device, as very connected to and almost no different than what's going on in real space. So I'll give an example as a teacher. So my last job, I was head of a school, but I taught U.S. history. I wanted to be in the classroom at all times with kids. These were 11th graders. And you'd walk into the room and, you got a bunch of kids in front of you. And some of them are talking to one another, that, those moments when the classes start, you haven't quite gotten going, people are filing in, but they're all talking about something. And they know this really important thing that's happening. But you, as the adult, you have no idea. You have no idea what's going on. And what's happened is that somebody has done or said something on Facebook or on Snapchat or whatever it is, and they all know what it is in kid land. But we as adults, we actually don't. Right. It's all connected for them. And there are these other spheres that, are just as important, in particularly the space of social media, with good and bad. We can get back to that. And for us, we might be thinking there's a distinction, but for them, there's not. And I think that's one of those things we sort of have to unlearn, and then think about what are the implications for our parenting when we go forward and try to give advice to our kids.
So let's talk about, for example, screen time. Right. So there's I think in the book, you give some really good examples of timing. But the reality, let's take the pandemic, which I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about right now. Yep. Screen time is just very different in terms of how we think about it. So how does the connected parent approach think about it, and how does it work with the child in trying to understand how do we think about screen time in the world of the pandemic, remote learning? Well,
thanks a lot, Nichole. This is one of those questions that's very hard to answer in a variety of ways. So I think about BC, or before COVID, and then kind of after COVID, right? So let's start with BC, and then we'll talk about COVID in a moment, or our current moment. So before COVID, which is of course when we drafted most of this book, the interesting thing was the page proofs were sent to us in March of 2020 as the pandemic was kind of breaking in a big way. So we had a chance to do a little bit of work just reflecting on what COVID looked like, but we obviously didn't rewrite the book, nor did we have any data really based on what was going on. But on screen time, this is one of the things I think that comes up most frequently for parents. And I totally get why this is a tricky issue. What we tried to do is look at all the best research by age that was out there, and then superimpose the things that we'd learned from other parents. So in the pre-COVID era, what we gathered and what others have said is it does depend on how old the kid is, and it depends on the context of your household. But let me just start with the basics. So if a child is tiny, when they call it an infant, 0 to 2 or so, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics and many researchers of all levels, my wife, as I mentioned, as a early childhood person, they all agree that screens are not a good thing for kids. There is no benefit to baby Einstein. There is no benefit to any of those things that you'll be sold that are supposed to be enhancing learning. And you're the education professor, so you can jump in and tell me I'm wrong. But as far as I've read, there's no benefit to it. The only thing that we say, and this is in talking to child development specialists, they say if connecting to a grandparent or a remote relative, this is again before COVID, is a possibility. In other words, have some screen time, Zoom or a FaceTime with a grandparent, that's fine for the 0 to 2 year old. But beyond that, don't do it. Like, don't have the TV on in the background, don't do baby Einstein. Okay, next chunk, there's a period of time, and we go through all the ages in the book. I won't take the rest of the hour to do all the detail, but there's another period of time as the kids are getting older where it makes sense for them to be exposed to some degree of screen time. And the key there would be to start setting some limits. And so it's not like the television's on in the background all the time and so forth, but where they understand what those rules are. And then you get to a point where they're the age of the tween age, where your nieces and nephews were, and that moment when they start to get their own devices and so forth, and you've got another set of rules that you need to impose then. And one of the keys at this moment is, of course, that if you have set limits before, you can be loosening the limits now, and it's not a free-for-all, right? So it really helps to have thought about this from the start, so that it's very hard to make harsher limits, right, than you had before. But there's a moment where you can say, okay, we will get you that cell phone. And for most young people, and actually really across the socioeconomic divides, increasingly, kids tend to get it in the same era, sort of 12 and 13. We will pay for this, we'll give it to you, but you need to use some, here's some limits, and here's what they are. And at that age, many students will follow you. However, once you get into the real teenage years, there is no way to enforce limits. It just doesn't work. And you can say, oh, but it might work. It doesn't. It just doesn't work. There's almost no kid on the entire planet who will honor your limits of screen time.
Anyway, they can't figure it out.
They can't. There's no way. They will route around it, and it will undermine your trust. So by that time, it's so important that you have developed that relationship where you can talk to them about it, where you can maintain some control, and where ultimately the kinds of skills and the ways in which you've been talking about it help them to limit their own screen time in a variety of ways. And we talk about specific strategies you can go into in the book. Part of it, of course, is helping them to see the value of doing other things and, not being on screens, and the value of when you're studying, for instance, not having other screens going, right? And how much more homework and better you can do, or how much better you perform in sports if you get the sleep you need, and how that has to do with putting away the device and so forth. So there's a whole set of arguments, of course, for how you can constrain it. But at a certain point, the bets are off in terms of being able to control it. Now, COVID.
Okay.
This is the hard problem. And there's, I don't think there's anything any of us can say. Our kids have to be online in order to learn. They have to be online in order to have their social and emotional development happen. They miss their friends. It's their only way to connect in a pandemic. And so in some ways, what's happened is the whole screen time debate has gone out the window, because there's no way to constrain it. And it is not a good thing. Ultimately, we don't know the effect of it, I don't think. But what it forces us to do is to think differently about screen time and focus more on the quality of the time than on the quantity of the time. And how is it that young people are actually spending as much of that time doing the stuff they're supposed to do, which is around learning, for instance, or connecting to friends, and sometimes gaming and other things that could be fun, and also finding some other stuff to do. And it does mean getting outside safely distanced and so forth, and exercising. It does mean playing board games. It does mean doing things that are, we call it device-free time in various ways. It's a huge challenge. There's nothing simple about it. We don't know the effects will be on kids, but as parents, we're all just doing the best we can during this period.
Do you have any thoughts around coming out of COVID in terms of how to reestablish and re-engage around screen time? Have any thoughts around how to think about that? Hopefully that's coming.
Hopefully it's coming. Absolutely. Yeah, knocking on all the wood we have, and all the praying to the vaccine providers and everybody else who can help make this happen. So yeah, I mean, I think it is important that as parents we are clear about what we mean during this period, so that things are different during the pandemic, and it doesn't mean that we're going to go back to what it was during the pandemic in terms of particularly something like screen time. So I think to do some of those preparatory conversations now, and as I mentioned before, where it's easier to have rules that you can loosen up right over time with kids and child psychology. In this case, I think partly is to say, we have lots to look forward to when we get done with COVID. And part of it is actually spending less time, doing Zooms and being connected. And I think for some kids, we can get into the inequity issues because there are lots of concerns there. But for some kids, what I've been hearing from them is sort of this hierarchy, which is, of course, every kid likes a snow day and doesn't want to have school. So of course, that's up there. But then there's actually in-person school. And then there's Zoom school. And, at this point for many kids, they really don't want to be on Zoom school particularly, and they'd rather be together. And so figuring out ways for them to think about and anticipate what matters, what's helpful about face-to-face. Why do you care? Like, don't you have just as much time to be connected to other young people? And I think in some ways we may recapture some of what's great about the tactile and the in-person by virtue of having this deep saturation. That's a hope, obviously, but we'll see.
It's interesting as we one of the things to think about in terms of equity or diversity, I'll say this more about diversity right now, and in the COVID, as an African-American, living in a community that isn't, majority African-American, what the pandemic has done for me, and I've seen with many of my friends who have kids, it sort of has opened up the opportunity to rethink affinity groups and learning together. And I've seen my college friends come together with their kids learning together. And I think it is challenging us or giving us the permission to not just think of geography as or where I go to school as what our natural learning groups are, but to begin to reimagine what is it about, what we share that can allow us to learn together. So I am curious, in some sense, I think of where the pandemic has in terms of pods, I think is taken away geography as that forcing function. What have you seen, or have you seen ways in which families and parents are restructuring their learning communities? And we oftentimes think about that, particularly for families, more resource families, but I actually think there's some powerful opportunities going on for our families of color. Have you seen any of this or thought about how the pandemic is like allowing us to think differently about how we structure learning in our communities?
It's a beautiful concept. And, I hadn't thought about it, of course, in just the way you suggested, although it's extremely compelling. I do think that one thing, you started out early by saying, the twin pandemics and the idea about at once, it's the racial reckoning, which is not news to most people, but it's for some people it's more so in light of George Floyd's murder and otherwise. But certainly, the focus on our racial inequities that have been highlighted through the COVID period and otherwise, twinned with the effects of the health crisis. Those things together are in kids' minds. They're not two separate things. These are combined, and they are, I think, going to be defining for many young people. And of course, we can talk about the other divides we have in our country. But I think for kids who are paying attention in any sense to public affairs, they're in schools like the 38 who have so kindly supported this session, and where schools are doing a good job of bringing a certain kind of consciousness to mind. What's being unearthed, I think, is a degree of awareness that's different. I know of young people in Evanston and in other parts of Chicago where I'm based and elsewhere who went to their first protests right during this period and did so wearing a mask and did so in a social distance way. But they first, took to the streets to say, to talk about the unfairness and the role that we have as white people to play a role in dealing with racial inequities and ending or addressing racial inequities and so forth. So I do think there's a power to this period and awareness. I think that what's wonderful, this idea about kind of code-making networks in some ways. I think the idea of being able to have different kinds of constellations and connections is absolutely something I've seen. I've been impressed by, sometimes it's families that have been, physically distant, and they're able to have, cousins all of a sudden on Sunday nights come together and be connected in a larger group. That's a different kind of affinity that, was not possible and nobody thought to do but for Zoom, right? And it kind of had a forcing function of this sort. And I think you're putting that a little bit more broadly in the sense of learning pods or affinity groups, and whether the affinity has to do with African-American women or it has to do with a variety of different things. I think those possibilities of the technology, which may have been there before, but we didn't really think about or we didn't use. I think those are very interesting and positive forms of connection. At MacArthur Foundation, we're focused on areas of youth participation, as we have been in the past as one of our grant-making areas. And you're seeing through some of that work the way in which young people are more active in lots of ways in communities, and the technologies are a part of that, and forming different kinds of connections. And so we're interested in supporting people and organizations that are making new things and new connections of that sort happen, and with a goal, obviously, in long run of reducing racial inequities and other kinds of ethnic disparities.
And so part of, as we're having this conversation, running through my head is the assumption that everyone has access, right? We're talking about a connected parent, kids connecting, and even we've seen in COVID, everyone doesn't. Like, everyone's on a Zoom call, everyone doesn't necessarily have the connectivity for 4 kids in a household to be there. But I think we're getting to the point where we assume that this access is almost the same as what a telephone was. Everyone needs to have access to the telephone. Everyone needs to have access to internet, and also has to have access to devices. What do you see? I'm going to change it a little bit. Do you think that from an equity standpoint, that access should be like a utility right now, and that right now schools are responsible for giving out devices, but in some sense, in this period, shouldn't cities give out devices and internet such that everyone has the ability to have access and also to learn outside of the school day in the summer? Do you think the COVID is making us maybe rethink to ensure that everyone is able to connect and learn in ways that are necessary?
100%. I think I thought this before, but I think it even more so in the context of COVID. As well as I do, and better than I do, some of the data around this. But in Chicago, in the public schools this spring, 20% of kids didn't have access to the internet, and in that context, without having the right device and a right high-speed network, you couldn't go to school. Right. And the learning loss for that group of 20% of kids is just, unfathomable. Right. And of course, we always have learning loss in the summers, and something your work has been great about trying to address. But, it's a real problem. And some of that's been addressed in the fall and the winter because of, frankly, a lot of charities. Right. People have stepped up and given a lot of money. Chicago Connected is a very cool effort. MacArthur is one of many, many donors to it. But, it's basically, people stepping up and paying for devices and connectivity for kids who didn't have it. And as you've said, it is largely lower income kids, and it tends to be Black and brown communities that are hardest hit, right? That's not to say it's not exclusively, but that's the bulk of what we're seeing. So like we said before, COVID has this effect, I think, of just shining a spotlight on something and saying, okay, like, are we okay as a society that for 2 or 3 months, you're going to have no learning for these kids, right? That's just not okay, I think, in our democracy. So what's the issue? Well, it's that we don't see universal access to broadband. We don't see the need to connect in these ways as anything close to a right. We see it as something, if you can pay for it, great. If not, it's, too bad. And that's been our national policy. It's been our state policy. It's been our municipal policy in most places in the United States. And I think it will change. I think there is, I do believe that we will see this differently. We obviously see electricity and telephones differently, right? We made that decision many, many decades ago that we were going to see this kind of connectivity differently. And I think that this experience will be to say, okay, let's think about sort of common carrier notions. Let's think about notions of what kind of universal access should be seen closer to a right than a privilege in our society. And if it's the access to healthcare, which it is now, right? If it's the access to the internet for school, if it is the access to the lifeline of social and emotional learning and all the rest, I think we need to be more serious about providing access.
I'm gonna jump in on the access to the internet for school. And one of the I think the issues I'm really trying to push now is understanding access to internet for learning, right? And I think can you talk about the distinction between learning and for parents to understand the role of school, the role of libraries, the role of museums, the role of our civic institutions in helping to ensure that we're raising, young folks who of course, can get jobs and have the STEM skills, literacies, but also are civic active in their communities, know their communities are engaged. Can you talk a little bit about learning as not just school, but learning, about life and what is the role of the parent, the connected parent in connecting those opportunities, particularly in today's age. Whereas I think before, I think about from my parents, it was like, let's make sure it's almost like a list. You need to read these things, you need to experience these things, and that's going to prepare you. But I don't think there is no list now. And so how do we think, how is learning changed? And how do we need to think about learning as a connected parent differently from our own experiences?
Absolutely. I'll start, but if it's okay, I'm going to end with a question about YOUmedia and some of your work. So just a chance to maybe bring in some of your research and your practice too. So, we share a philosophical bent, which says a lot of learning happens in schools, but a lot of learning happens not in schools. And the internet is a way in which digital technologies are a way in which those two things can get connected. And so libraries, of course, are something that I think we underestimate and we underinvest in societies, but librarians as school librarians and then as public librarians in communities, I think play such a crucial role in opening the world to kids in a different way. I mean, I think we all have our experience of having walked into a library for the first time, and whether it's a story time experience you have, or the first time you saw a shelf of books and you had a call number and you went and you saw this book and then you thought, oh my gosh, I want this one. And then you come out with your arms full of books, like the opening of the world of knowledge that comes through libraries, and the internet being, of course, a way to bridge that during this period. Museums, of course, and we can go down the list of other institutions, but thinking about the way in which a student's learning journey is not simply through what they do when they've got a butt in a chair in a classroom with a teacher in front of them. It's actually a lot of experiences that are connected often through devices now, and that are connected in such a way that they actually drive and improve interest, right? They actually draw from the interests that young people have and allow them to pursue it in ways that they never, ever could before. In some kids, that may be about community service. It may be because they really want to volunteer in a particular way. They can find a place where they can go and volunteer. Maybe it's following their faith tradition and they're able to figure something out. Or maybe they are LGBTQ as a young person. They need a way to explore that. Or maybe they have, concerns about their mental health and they can explore. There are all sorts of things I think that the technology can do that will extend and connect to the other kinds of learning they're doing. So the role of parents, to my mind, is to help support that extended network of learning and that way in which the learning is not just about what you do, again, if you're lucky enough to be having a butt in a chair right now with a great teacher, but rather actually connecting it to a lot of other things. And I think we tend to overprogram our kids and try to say, you need to be doing in the institution as a learner in the classroom during the day, and then you need to go to soccer practice, then you go to band practice, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, I think one thing that is wonderful about this period of time is a lot of what kids are doing online, whether it's through gaming or online or social, they're actually learning a ton of stuff in interstitial moments. And I think we need to make more space and opportunity for that. And one of the reasons that I was so attracted to your work, Nichole, through DML was, of course, the vistas that you opened through YOUmedia and through the Digital Youth Network. And I wonder if you give an update on maybe definition for those who are not familiar with it, but update on how those projects are going and how you might answer the same question.
Answer myself, ask a question to answer. So, wow, years ago, 2004, we were fortunate to get funded from MacArthur to really ask the question of what does digital media look like in the lives, particularly of African-American kids? And how do we make sure from a literacy standpoint that African-American kids are growing up with the same digital skill sets that everyone else is? And that journey took us to focus first on schools and to figure out how to work with the University of Chicago charter schools and develop kids' digital literacies within a charter school context. But then those kids grew up And in Chicago, they go to schools all over the city. And we were fortunate for MacArthur to ask us to partner with the Chicago Public Libraries to reimagine a library in that space and reimagine what could be. And so UMedia, Harold Washington Library, was the first space, one of the first spaces I think in the country that said, let's put digital media at the center and let's figure out how to engage and invite kids in. And what was really unique, and I think is relevant why I really think about the role of civic institutions, a library is open to everyone. And in Chicago, it's a place that there's libraries in every community. So you think about it's a place that you're not afraid to go to. And particularly, I think for African-American kids, trying to engage digital media, you need it to be in a place where it was accessible. And the main thing that we learned out of there is that if you put kids in contact with mentors, with adults who can model and can engage with the technology, and it's not a class, but it's an opportunity to learn and to use these technology with peers, kids will put in the work, they'll learn the skills, they'll engage them and integrate them into their social life. And so that work, we were so fortunate to be alongside our partners and so many of our partners in MacArthur and seeing that. But right now, those young people, many of those young people who are in that work are some of the leaders in the activism. You know, if you look at Vic Mensa, Chance the Rapper, you look at some of our videographers, folks who are actually now mentors. We have Marcus Prince, who's now a teacher up here in Evanston. They came out of that space of UMedia that created creativity and sort of opened up, I think a lot of what you talk about in The Connected Parent, created a space for choice, but also some expectations about participation in which they develop their own way of thinking about how to have impact in the world. So the challenge for me is those spaces then don't reoccur everywhere, right? If you have a space like that that's successful in a school, then you would replicate it. But we right now don't really sort of understand the value, I think, enough of those civic spaces that I think are critical for making sure our kids are learning how to use these technologies effectively to sort of be able to replicate them. So so in your work, as you've looked around, are those spaces sort of unique, or are UMedia's everywhere? Or what are the other types of replications of these things? Because I think they're essential. And for me, I think schools are essential, but I think you need schools, you need healthy schools, you need healthy community spaces that work together with parents to make sure that kids have spaces to sort of learn and develop in the ways in which we want them to.
I'd say in my travels, Nichole Pinkard, there are too few people as inspiring as you, and that there are too few communities that have replicated it. But I will say I've been hugely impressed by the number of UMedia and UMedia-like spaces I have encountered in my travels, and sometimes it's in the big cities like Charlotte, Miami, and places where you might think that what's going on in Chicago is actually going to be replicated, but it's also in some smaller places, and I think certainly UMedia as an idea was one that I think it's the defining idea for what we're describing. And so it's, I think when people have this conversation about spaces, particularly for underprivileged kids, but, could be for really any, teens that use digital media as a bridge into this broader world. And as you say, have sort of agency and an expectation of engagement and commitment and mentorship at the core. I think all roads lead back to UMedia. And I think it's something that will I hope, continue to expand over time. I do think that the learning outcomes are so clear from it and I don't think they're that expensive to do.
So then how do we empower? So I think parents are empowered to have expectations for schools, right? I don't know if we're empowered to have expectations for our libraries and our parks, which are civic funds to actually to work together in concert to create a learning space, and so I think it would be interesting, I think, out of the pandemic to come out of this and say, how do we reimagine these spaces together? Because schools are critical, and that's where, they're still critical, but oftentimes these other spaces right now, or, it's the parks where kids are in right now. It's some of the libraries that are also being hubs for learning, where learning can occur. And I know, given your work, I'm curious to see how can we support parents in beginning to expand their expectations of these other civic spaces to play their role, and particularly from an equity standpoint, I think they can play a role, because like in Chicago, the parks are where many kids, in the summer, and we have a great partnership now with the parks and an initiative called STEAM Ambassadors, where we're putting STEAM programming in the parks in the summer, led by community college students who are trained by academics and researchers with their curriculum. So I guess we can bucket that for a little bit, but I do think there's a really interesting opportunity to think about civic life. And so can we think a little bit about how you even have a whole chapter in here around civic life and the role of parents to engage with their kids to understand their role in making sure that we have a healthy society?
Absolutely. Let me start with the beginning part of your comment, and then I'll come back to the civic life chapter in the Connected Parent, just for kind of a summary. But on your first point about the way in which we think about libraries and other institutions like parks and so forth in our communities, I think it's such a good question, and I do think it's one of those things that, in the context of the pandemic and the twin pandemics that we've been talking about, that comes to light. So scroll back to March. Of 2020, and all of a sudden schools have to go online. They have to shut the in-person very, very quickly. Most institutions are not ready. Most teachers aren't ready, right? It's hard. And as we noted, some large percentage, in the case of Chicago, as many as 20% of kids don't have access. So where do they turn? Well, typically in the setting, they would turn to libraries, right? Libraries would be the place where you get the free Wi-Fi, in addition to, by the way, McDonald's and Starbucks, right? Places like that. Which we know from the data are places where kids will get their access. But pandemic happens, these places shut, including libraries, right? And so yes, you could drive your car to the parking lot of the library and have it leak out the war driving thing, but that's not some work for most kids. That's a ridiculous thing that kids learning is everybody's gonna be driving their or being outside in the library parking lots. But one thing that I think we see at that point is the essential nature of these things that we take for granted in our communities as being so central to kids' lives. And so I think you're right that from an activism perspective, to say we know that librarians are trying to do more with less than ever before. This is an incredibly devoted group of educators and public servants, and clearly want to be deeply relevant and know that their world is not just about books anymore. But it is important to continue to support them and also to challenge, right? What is the role of a library in terms of an equity agenda? And I know from talking to the new president of the American Library Association, Tracy Hall, who you probably know, there are some amazing, really inspiring people who are saying, let's put that equity agenda right at the center of what libraries do and then figure out what that means, right? And to my mind, it's exactly what you're describing. It's a combination of using the technology in an important way. And we have now things like the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, that is a free access library with 40 million plus objects in it that anybody can get access to and that libraries can work with. So the technology is allowing for new things that we were never able to do before. And that's, by the way, based here in Chicago. And you've got people like Tracy Hall and her colleagues who are figuring out how to center racial equity in the library agenda and bringing in all kids and thinking about inclusion in a different way. And of course, they've always been inclusive institutions, the public libraries, but doing it in a different and meaningful and intensive and intentional way, I think is so important. So I think it's great that you put that on the table, and it seems to me it should be on the agenda, for all kind of parenting groups who are thinking about this and focused on it. But I'll say that you'll find willing partners, I think, in most libraries. To the chapter in the book on activism. So again, what we've been trying to do with this book, The Connected Parent, was to take a lot of the myths that we heard and the questions and concerns, and then try to address them based on the research. So one of the questions I think that is in a lot of parents' minds are our kids more slackers, than ever before? Are they less, active and involved in civic life? And of course, people are often concerned about voting rates, and there are a bunch of different, data points over some decades that showed young people not voting as much as they should in some elections. Now, there are exceptions, including the one we've just had, to those data points. But what's more important and more interesting is that when you look at surveys around community and civic engagement, those are often at 50-year highs for young people right now, not lows. This is a group of young people who are civically active, particularly around community engagement. There are kinds of things that are service-oriented, and political activism, taking to streets, actually protesting. And of course, some of it has to do with particularly the Black Lives Matter movement and the things that we have seen. And you could say that's going to be a blip, but I don't think so. I think this is something that's going to be a little bit more sustained. And I think connects to things like climate. It extends to things like economic justice, as well as racial and other forms of social justice. So some people, I think, have been concerned that in this digital age, because a kid can go on Facebook and click like on something, that this is actually a way that they're just being clicktivist or slacktivist. These are the sort of derisive phrases about kids these days. I just don't think it's true. And I don't think the data backs it up. I think what they see is those are ways of engaging that are meaningful, but modest, right, in effect. But the things that follow it and the ways in which those lead to more engaged and deeper engagement over time for kids are very real. So let's take, for example, the hashtags Black Lives Matter or the hashtag Me Too. These were started, right, as online activist, gestures, right, concepts on something like Twitter, but they turn out to be definitive social movements of their time. And absolutely, they bring millions of young people into the mix. And of course, some older people too, right? So starting out with something that you might think is just a hashtag, like what's that important about putting, say her name or saying Me Too or Black Lives Matter, whatever it might be, in a tweet, they actually lead to massive institutions. And you can, reflect on this in ways that would be more interesting than what I might say. But, I think in some ways, if you think about the kinds of institutions that you come out of Color of Change, that come out of Black Lives Matter, that come out of, we could go down the list in various forms of politics. I think they're in some ways more dynamic than the pre-existing, the historical kind of activist organizations. And some of that started with the kind of online networking that young people were doing.
You sort of need the online networking and from the reality of just the pockets of where people live. As someone from Kansas City, Kansas, right, the ability to connect and work together and activate together across communities, I think is just so essential. That's coming out of the social media, but then it also then resonates in terms of on the ground.
Yeah.
Work. So it's not one or
exactly. It goes back to your concept about the connection, right? The online and the offline being connected.
And so speaking of this, and sort of, I want to get into a little bit of privacy issues, because I think we're in this really interesting moment right now with the Apple versus Facebook.
Yeah.
And given your work that you've done on the internet, can you say a little bit about there's something to me at stake around this, this conversation we're having around privacy and our data, and do we give it away for free, or the approach that Apple is beginning to take. And in reading the book, I found myself thinking about how so much of how parents are now engaging with their kids is framed by these decisions that tech folks are making. And now, full disclosure, I am a developer. We have a platform of families here. If you have the digital backpack in D65, if your kid uses a platform EL3, that comes out of my team, and we do that. And we have our own social network platform we create. So I'm asking this as someone who probably has made some decisions that from a privacy standpoint that might not have been, the most informed. But I'm curious how to think about the challenge of where we are in terms of privacy and where we need to come out of it. And from a parent standpoint, what does that mean for the conversations that they need to or should be thinking about having with their kids?
Well, Nichole, anything you developed and your team developed, I would have a high degree of confidence that it would be privacy respecting for my own kids anyway. So I wouldn't be worried about your work, but I am worried about as a topic. I think we're looking at the first generation of young people who, for their entire life, it will be recorded or surveilled, right? From the sonogram and the mother's stomach to the baby pictures and everything else that adults put online. There's a wonderful book if you care about this about early kinds of things that parents do to kids in this way. It's called Sharenthood by Leah Plunkett, who's a wonderful professor, has thought about this from MIT
we had
Press.
That conversation in our family.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a post of my nephews. Yeah. Okay.
It's got to be a family conversation of this sort, because a lot of the privacy sort of violations are done by adults, right? To kids effectively before they have a chance to make a decision. That's one of the rules that we've had in our household, which is we ask kids if they're willing to have us put a picture on our page of our kids, right? And we don't do that until they're able to answer that question, because they should be able to shape.
So a kid if their parent is putting their pictures on, and of course, Facebook, you can put their name on. By the time they get to 14 and they get on Facebook, they have a whole profile of, okay.
Exactly. And Nichole, think back to our, high school age or whatever, you in theory could go from one school in Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri, and you could end up in Chicago, and you could kind of remake your identity, right? You could have one kind of hairstyle then, you could have a different, and nobody would necessarily know. That is not possible, right? For kids these days, if in fact particularly their parents, have been posting all the way along all these photos for them. So I do think that's something important to focus on. Second thing I'd say is modeling is so important. You talked about this very early on. But the effect of modeling, what we do, is so powerful. So if you are telling kids you need to limit your screen time and all you're doing is playing word cookies or whatever on your phone all the time, it's not going to resonate, right? Kids have the best meter for people being not accountable, right, or being hypocritical. So one of the things we talk a lot in the book about is the importance of this modeling and how our own behavior affects what our kids do, of course, but also kind of how effective our rules could be. But let me come back also to your question and comment about the technology developers and in particular companies. So I was teaching in class a couple months ago, or last month, I guess in January, to Harvard Law School students, and it was about technology and the public interest. And during that period were the Capitol riots on January 6th, and some people call it December the 37th, 2020, right? So they could sweep into the previous year. But horrible set of events, and of course, and we're not political on here, as Lonnie has told us, so I'm not going to be specifically critical of the president, but the inciting tweets from the president resulted in his being kicked off of Twitter. Known among internet scholars as the great deplatforming. And in particular, this was a moment, I think, where people looked at the power of these companies in a different way. So you and I may look at this and say, okay, the president was being horrific, doing something terrible. Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, made the right decision to take him offline. Like, you may have cheered for that and been wanting that to happen. However, when people also step back and say, do we really want to vest that much authority in a relatively few number of people? In particular, when you think about it, they are billionaires who are white and male pretty consistently across these platforms, right? Is that in a democracy what we want to do when we think about the kind of democracy we want to have going forward? So I think there's a huge amount of focus right now on the extraordinary power of a very small number of platforms, in particular Twitter, of course, Facebook, of course, Google, maybe think about Amazon, maybe think about Microsoft, but really these sort of key social media platforms and how much control they have over speech, but then also privacy. And I think that these twin concepts are very much coming into play. And in the United States, we have made a decision, unlike much of the rest of the world, say Europe or China, where most of the other development has gone on the internet, to give these companies a free pass. We have said when it comes to speech, there's this rule called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and it basically says the bad acts on your platform that you didn't do, but people did, are things that we're not going to hold the companies liable for. So we have given them a free pass on all of the speech stuff. And with respect to privacy, we've basically said there are almost no privacy rules in the United States relative to these companies. We basically said it's a matter of contract. So in that click-through thing, right, that you click through and you say, you can do anything you want with my data, you more or less can do anything you want with the data if you're Facebook and so forth. And so companies have, to be clear, taken a lot of advantage of this freedom that we've had in the United States. Again, Europe has treated it differently. China has definitely dealt with it differently. Iran has dealt with it differently. But the United States has been incredibly freedom and libertarian loving on this front. And I think we are realizing that having it at this extreme is actually quite dangerous for democracy.
And so for here then, that requires then for a parent here in America, given the freedom, like what then would you say from how it's not monitoring, right? I think if we go back to what you said, you wouldn't do screen time limits. And, if it's, I know on Tuesday, I'm gonna have to turn over my phone and you're gonna check it, then of course I'm Snapchat and all these things, I can get rid of it. So what is the process and ways in which you establish, reflection points and conversations with, with your kids and even with ourselves, right? Sometimes we need to check ourselves and think about how we're sharing and what is the data we're putting forth. So can you say something about what you do with your own family or how you think about you're being reflective on how much you're sharing and put in place strategies for making changes if necessary?
Absolutely. So, I think part of it goes back to that conversation. You want a relationship with the kids where the point is you're relevant and trusted, and so you can have that conversation. Second thing is, I think, being able to describe stories that are relevant to kids. So I think every kid knows of some kid who posted something they shouldn't online and had some bad thing happen to them, right? We all know that example, and some of it is, some of it might relate to the conversation we're having about diversity and race, right? Somebody posted something that was, use of language they shouldn't have used online, so forth, and it had repercussions. It's a way to talk about that and its effects. It's a way to talk about, the posting of the stupid party they were at, and the holding a beer or whatever it might have been, and the effect that might have. So I think using stories is obviously something that's helpful in those ways, and to get kids to reflect. We know that the teenage brain is not fully developed, right? We can get into the neuroscience of it, but it's straightforward, and adolescence now extends well into the 20s by most definitions, from 10 to 24 or so. So we know that students, young people, don't make great decisions. So it's trying to give them feedback loops that allow them not to make terrible choices. And so, to some degree, services like Snapchat and elsewhere can help, in the sense that things
you gotta
are
let
more
them
likely.
make choices, right? So one of the things is not, don't hold them back from it. You got to let them make the choices and work with them to figure out and have conversations.
Yeah, and hopefully they're skin knees they get, but rather than kind of broken bones, right? And there are ways in which they can learn from those things. I think we might be getting the hook here. I see Lonnie popping up.
Oh, never a hook. Never. You guys could just keep at it. So thank you so much, Nichole. Great moderation here. Just love the conversation. So much mutual respect between the two of you. I know I speak for everyone watching that it was really, really great. There was one question that someone asked about how they can join after hours. If you look at chat, you can see that we give a link. John's book is for sale through our bookseller, The Bookstall, and they'll send you an email with a link to register for after hours. So it's a separate Zoom event starting. We give a 5-minute bio break, so it'll start about 8:05. So we have a question that was submitted in advance from Ellen on her registration form. She said, any advice or information specific to dealing with young adults on the spectrum or with special needs and navigating social media? And either one of you could answer.
Nichole, do you want to take any first crack at that?
You can. Okay.
Oh, thank you. No, go ahead.
So I don't necessarily, I don't want to speak on somewhere I don't necessarily have the advice on, particularly for young people on the spectrum. What I can say is, if you connect me to that individual, Lonnie, I will have some advice and some resources.
Okay, so I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Okay, that's
no.
John, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
No. I likewise. I'm happy to make connections. It is not an area of expertise that I have, but I do think that. But the question is very important, because I think it also says there's only so much kind of general advice that we can give on topics like this, and in particular, I would say. Where students are struggling with something particular, that's figuring out how you take the basic research and then develop it in a particular setting, of course, is so important. So I'm sorry not to be able to generalize, but I think it's probably safer not to in that way.
But we will have information for them tomorrow, I promise.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I can send it right out, because I know the person asked. Oh, we have a question from Timothy. Tim, do you have any thoughts on whether the act of revoking your child's iPad privileges due to bad behavior, etc., results in any harm in terms of taking away virtual social interaction with their friends?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be a last resort, obviously, to yank the entire device right now in particular. So I was talking earlier today with a neuroscientist who studies the social and kind of emotional development of young people. And she was describing the way in which you have to balance, of course, on the one hand, the excessive screen time and the need to be able to use this as a hook and to take something away, with the fact that these devices right now are a lifeline for young people and the social and emotional piece of the development of any teenager right now. And we all know that, particularly in some communities, but really across the board, stress, anxiety, and so forth are high for young people. And so I believe that if it's at all possible to allow for as much of the social and emotional connection to other young people, which is so crucial to youth development and is in such short supply right now, you've got to figure out a way to honor that.
Yeah, and to add to that, part of what one can do is change the environment, right? My niece my nephew is sitting right next to his mom, right? And so she's not taking away the device, she's changing and adapting the environment where some of the, behavior might have occurred. So I think that's, we wouldn't take away a pencil. So how do we adapt the environment to make sure that we have more of an understanding and a lens on what's taking place?
That's wonderful, wonderful way to put it. And yeah, thinking again about the quality and the quality versus the quantity of the activity, right? And the context in which it occurs.
All right, we're at 8:00. I want to make one observation, and I'm not going to go late, I promise. And I was thinking about, as you were answering, both of you answering that question, thinking about how the last year, and of course, we're not done yet, so into the foreseeable future, how it's interesting in terms of developing skills for parents with kids in looking at the primacy of context. Right. So in one context, this device is X, and in another context, this device is Y, right? And that it is about, because of course, as a pivot comes back, as kids at some point do actually end up back in schools, and as the COVID rules shift then to post-COVID rules, that kind of larger meta conversation about life more generally by use of this as a metaphor of how context impacts behavior, how you approach things, rules, regulations, and how that shifting landscape shifts a lot of that. But anyway, that was just
That's such an important point.
crossed my thought. Okay, so we're at 8:01. Thank you everyone for tuning in.